It is my great pleasure to welcome Aaron Benanav. Aaron comes from United States originally. He's a historian, but currently, as you can see on this slide, he's based in Berlin as postdoctoral researcher at Humboldt University in Berlin. And today he's going to give us talk. Title you can also see on this slide. Aaron actually, end of last year, published his first book with similar title, Automation and the Future of Work. And the book was published by Verso, and since it was published, it, let's say, gained a lot of traction because it talks, Aaron writes about stuff that is, let's say, a really hot topic currently. But he also in Berlin currently works on some other pretty interesting stuff. One is post-scarcity economics, and I think that we'll have a lot of questions about that concept. And the other one is history of global unemployment after the Second World War. So we hope the books are coming soon. And in today's talk, Aaron will tell us a little bit more about the relationship and possible connections between the precarity, insecurity of work, and automation, or the increasing use of artificial intelligence, robotics, etc. And also about some of the ideas that have come up about the possible solutions. One of maybe more popular ones that we have heard a lot, people who were attending Green Academy at Vis, I know that heard on each session more or less something about universal basic income. Let's say that Aaron has a little bit different stance on the UBI than what was mostly proposed by people who were advocating for UBI. One of maybe more interesting things about UBI is that, I mean, if guys like Elon Musk, Bill Gates, and Mark Zuckerberg are all for the universal basic income, then there must be something problematic about it. But without further ado, I give floor to Aaron. He's going to talk for 45 minutes, 1 hour, and then I'm sure we're going to have a fruitful discussion. So Aaron, floor is yours.
If it's possible, I'd like to just speak like this. Is that okay? Can you hear me? Ah, good. Perfect. Okay. Before I start talking, I just want to say thank you to Eva and Giovanna and the other members of the Ministry of Space. I thought maybe we could even give them a round of applause for just organizing. Because I've had a really great time here meeting a lot of you. I definitely, I appreciated the DJs last night. I stayed out, I think, until like 3 a.m. And then I got up and went on this beautiful hike. So if I fall over in the middle of the talk, don't worry. I'm just, trying to live life to its fullest while visiting Serbia. So, oh, really? Okay. Great. Okay. So the talk I'm going to give you today is drawn from a little bit from a book I just published, Automation and the Future of Work. And maybe I'll just sort of send that around. try to condense the normal version I give of that talk, because I want to say something about this new project I've been working on post-scarcity economics. But really, these investigations I've been doing, which have taken me away, in some sense, from my scholarly work, have really been inspired over the past 10 years by just what I see as an incredible growth and efflorescence of social movements and social struggles around the world. I'll just talk a little bit while we figure out the technical details here. Anyway, I've been really inspired by all of these social struggles, and I've been trying to think about, exactly as the title of this conference or forum, about horizons for change. Like, we live in an era of renewed movement and struggle, and the question is, where is it going? Where is it heading? What are the possibilities for an emancipatory future? And what should we, as participants in these movements and politics, what should we be fighting for? And so, in order to think about that, I've been really trying to research this new, what I call, automation discourse. Since around the mid-2010s, like 2015, we've seen this explosion of interest in ideas about automation and artificial intelligence and a possible end of work. You have just a few of the titles here that have come out. Of course, Andrew Yang in the United States made this very popular, running for the Democratic nomination on a kind of humanity-first platform about automation. But really, participants in this automation discourse come from across the political spectrum. You have people on the right, in fact, even quite conservative, neoliberal thinkers talking about automation, all the way to very left-wing thinkers trying to imagine a kind of automated, fully automated luxury socialism or communism. And, you know, I think what's interesting to me is that all these thinkers across the political spectrum, they share a certain vision that we're living in an age of accelerating technological change, which is going to bring about the end of work as we know it. What I find really interesting, again, is that across the political spectrum, from the right to the left, there's a certain view of what's happening, which I'll summarize for you here. The core propositions of what I call the automation theory. The first one is they say, look around you. Workers are already being replaced by ever more advanced machines. We can see this happening around us in our lives. They say this displacement that started to happen is the sign that we're on the verge of a truly qualitative transformation in work. We are going to, in the coming decades, achieve a largely or fully automated society. But the thinkers of this automation discourse, they don't see this as an unqualified good. They say that automation should entail our liberation from toil. This should be the greatest thing humanity's achieved in 10,000 years. But because most people have to work in order to live, if automation just continues in our society, it's not going to be a dream, it's going to turn out to be a nightmare of mass unemployment. So they say the only way to prevent this nightmare, and again, a fascinating thing that this is shared across from the right to the left, the only way to prevent this nightmare of mass unemployment is to implement a universal basic income and transition to a post-scarcity world, by which they mean a world where everyone's needs are met without having to work, and our identities are no longer centered on our working life, careers, etc. So I'm just going to give a little bit more background for like why they think this is happening. And obviously, one big example pictured here, the Tesla production plant, which used to be in Fremont, California, runs, you know, Elon Musk was saying that he was pushing for lights out production. It means production that involves no human beings, so you could just have the process run in the dark. So we have advanced industrial robotics, and then of course, machine learning and neural networks, the kind of computerization side of this automation discourse, pointing towards, they say, the possibility that we are about to experience a breakthrough to what they call artificial general intelligence, where computers will really be able to think like humans. Now, alongside these technological developments, the automation theorists point to a set of disturbing trends. One of these trends is so-called jobless recoveries. It means that after a recession or a downturn, the economy recovers, but this recovery comes without a reduction in unemployment. So this graph, I know everything's a little hard to see from where you are, but what it's showing is like over time, through these various recessions in the United States, the labor market has taken longer and longer to recover. So it takes longer and longer for the economy to replace the jobs that have been lost after a recession. And of course, you know, the evidence for this automation trend isn't only about loss of jobs, it's also about rising inequality. And in the United States, there's this famous graph of this divergence between wages and productivity. It means that, like, you know, work is becoming more productive, and that means that GDP is growing, income is growing, but wages have stagnated. And that's actually not only true in the United States, it's true across the entire OECD, so across the club of rich countries, and also, of course, across the world. We've seen in many countries rising inequality, very high rates of global inequality. So this is another piece of key evidence for this automation story. And lastly, you know, obviously pointing to the rise of this Silicon Valley elite. We have these Silicon Valley titans, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, competing with one another and with Richard Branson to, you know, get into space and go to Mars. And the spectacle, as many, I think was already talked about here, just of, you know, how we're just, you know, how these rich people are burning incredible amounts of fossil fuels to escape from Earth, leaving behind all of us on a burning planet. There's something really wrong with these things. So the question, or the kind of question posed by this automation discourse is, are these technological innovations, advanced robotics, automated production, artificial intelligence, and these trends in the labor market, higher unemployment and underemployment, precarity, inequality, are those things related? And if so, how are they related? So the book, which I've been passing around, Automation of the Future of Work, is really about this. It's trying to answer the question, are these automation theorists right? And I'm not only, in other words, is automation responsible for the growing difficulty workers face in finding or holding on to jobs? And I'm not only interested in this question from a critical perspective. I'm really interested in the kind of utopian dimensions of this discourse, as I said before. I'm interested in the ideas that these thinkers have about horizons of change. And I think looking at these automation theorists is a really important place for us to interact with the kind of utopian energies that our moment of change is generating. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is I'm just going to take you through, I've already given you some background on these ideas about automation. I'm going to talk about a paradox around the automation discourse, some lack of evidence, like some kind of problems with the empirical grounding of the theory. I'm going to talk about what I think is really going on, what's really behind rising precarity and inequality, which is a tendency towards stagnation in the economy. I'm going to talk about what the different view I'm going to present, the consequences that has for politics. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a different kind of utopian vision, or a different kind of vision about the horizons for change in our era that don't depend on automation to ground their ideas of a possible emancipation of humanity. So just to kind of now go into the meat of the talk. A lot of times when you read books about automation, you know, you see graphs like this, just this rising curve of technological change. And I know many of you are too far away to see it, but what it shows is just the rising processing power and the declining price of processing power, you know, this, from 8,000 years ago to the present. And the idea is that computers, we're getting more and more productive capacity out of our computers, and, you know, pretty soon they're going to pass the capacity of a mouse brain, and then they're going to pass the capacity of a single human brain, and eventually computers are going to be so smart that they will surpass the thinking capacity of all human brains combined, and that will be the moment that they call the singularity, this incredible transformation in our productive capacities. Oops, wrong one. So if the automation theorists were right, if that's what was happening, what we'd expect to see is that labor productivity would be growing at a really rapid pace. And sometimes that's confusing for people. Like, if computers were replacing human beings, why would the efficiency of labor be rising? But here, I mean, we can talk about it a little more in the questions if it's unclear, but people have a wrong idea about what this measure of labor productivity, what it actually measures. It doesn't measure what this worker, how productive this worker is, any given worker. It measures just how much is produced per hour of work. So if we're kicking workers out of the factory, if there's fewer and fewer workers in the factory and more is made by machines, that should show up in economic statistics as radical increases in labor productivity. Workers should be becoming more and more productive, and that should be the source of this incredible growth that the automation theorists think is going on. But what we see, in fact, is that even in manufacturing, which is the sector where advanced robotics and new computerization technologies are coming into play, instead of seeing this, like, this is the manufacturing sector in the United States, instead of just seeing this incredible rising curve, like in this picture, just this unstoppable growth, what we see is that the decade that's had this amazing increase in talk about automation, labor productivity is flatlined. There's been no growth no increase in efficiency in manufacturing during this era when there's so much talk about it in the United States. And actually, this trend in manufacturing can be seen in the economy as a whole. What we see, again, I'm sorry, this is too small, I think, for the size of our room here, but you can just trust me what I'm telling you is that instead of rapidly rising productivity in a new age of automation, what we see, weirdly, is the opposite. And this is called the productivity paradox that automation theorists sometimes note and try to explain away. But it's really important for you all to understand that in actual measurable terms, today, productivity is growing way slower than it did in the past. Whatever trends there are in the economy around computerization and automation are being overwhelmed by other trends that are pushing people into jobs where they actually work very inefficiently or where inefficiency is hard to grow. That's not only about, the world over, one of the most common jobs in the world is like informal street trader, jobs like that, where workers don't have available to them the tools and machines to work in an efficient way. It's also about the fact that we live in a world where more and more people work in healthcare, education, and other services where it's just very difficult to make that work more efficient. And so on the whole, we see this trend toward declining productivity growth. It's a little technical, but I promise we'll move quickly out of the technical dimensions. As productivity growth is falling, that actually should have the opposite trend to the one the automation theorists describe. It should be the case that jobs are disappearing at a slower pace than in the past. There's less churn in jobs, and I'll talk about how we do actually see that. But this trend of falling productivity has been overwhelmed by another trend, and here again, I know it's too small to see, but what's fascinating is that the economies, especially in the West, have been growing at a slower and slower pace over time. They haven't been experiencing this incredible technological transition to a rapidly expanding economy. In fact, it's just the opposite that's been the case. The United States is growing today at half the pace it did in the past, even before the coronavirus recession. And in Germany and Japan, some of the other largest advanced economies in the world, the drop-off in growth has been even more extreme, and it's been secular over time, which means that it's getting worse and worse over time. And so what we see in reality when we study not just the brilliant technologies, but the economy that they're a part of, is that it's not actually the case that jobs are being destroyed at an accelerating pace. That's just not, no one can find that evidence. In reality, what's happening is that the pace of job creation is slowing down. And that's why, for example, a lot of countries in the world suffer from major problems of youth unemployment. because it's really people who are just entering the labor market for the first time. Jobs are really not being created, especially for those people, as well as people who are losing their jobs. There's a real problem with job creation. And again, this problem really comes from this tendency that we're only just starting to talk about more in the popular imagination. And it's not, which is that we live in a time when the economy is just growing more and more slowly. And economists call this process secular stagnation. This is for the whole OECD. This is the club of rich countries that used to account for around 80% of all economic activity in the world. Now it's like about 60%. But those economies in the 60s were growing at about 5% per year. And now, this doesn't even include the coronavirus recession, this line, but now they're growing at a pace of about 1.5% per year. And what that means is that as these economies are slowing down, they're creating fewer jobs, and they are increasing the precarity of workers. It's making it harder and harder for people to find and keep their work. Why is this happening? What explains this long-term trend of economic slowdown? In a way, I talk about in my book how, there's a great, I don't know if you've ever seen this great movie by John Carpenter called They Live. It's like where Obey, like where that comes from. This guy, he finds a pair of sunglasses. And, the world looks much as it does, kind of rosy, and then when he puts on the sunglasses, he sees the world as it really is. And all the advertisements don't say, buy this Coca-Cola and you'll have a great life. They just say, like, obey, consume, etc. And in a way, I think, when you read these texts about automation, you can imagine, you look at your cell phone and you're like, wow, we just live in this incredibly advanced economy where all these things are possible. And then you put on the reality sunglasses and you just see, we live in a world of decrepit infrastructure, things are falling apart, there's all of this austerity and problems. And so the question is what explains this divergence between the beautiful vision of the automation theorists and the reality of our world? So I'm just going to give you a little sense of that now. We live in an era that's popularly described as an era of globalization, and it's been going on for a lot longer than since the 1980s. Economies all around the world since World War II have depended more and more on global trade for their growth. We live in an increasingly globalized world. And this is just this growing line of how much economies depend on trade. More than 30% of all economic activity is involved basically in trade today. And economists said that this trade was going to benefit everyone. More and more trade, everyone was going to specialize in different products and trade, and it was going to produce mutually beneficial patterns of growth. But what we actually see, and this data that I have comes from the World Trade Organization, not a left-wing organization, very much the opposite of that. And what the World Trade Organization shows is that actually the era of globalization has not been an era of specialization and growth, mutually beneficial growth. It's actually seen for the world as a whole, including China and its radical growth, this dramatic slowdown in the expansion, particularly of manufacturing and industry. Industry has not benefited in the way the economists have said from globalization. Globalization, instead of generating trade complementarity, so different firms specializing in different kinds of activities, it generated trade redundancies. All these firms in different countries and suppliers trying to sell the same kinds of goods and competing in ever more crowded markets to sell their goods. And as that happened, the post-war period some people call it the golden age of capitalism. It really wasn't so golden, and we could talk a lot about that. But this era of immense global industrialization, also very responsible for the climate crisis we face today, generated growing industrial overcapacity. All these countries, these countries were producing the same kinds of goods, and that drove down rates of investment. We can talk about any of these economic concepts. I know it's complicated, but the effect of this, which I really want to show you, is that over the past 30 years, the world has been beset by this trend of growing deindustrialization, which I'm sure people know about. Actually, Serbia, interestingly, is like slightly reindustrialized in recent years. But for the world as a whole, the major trend is the loss of industrial employment. And again, this isn't about some new breakthrough to automation technologies. It's actually, in my view, of course technological change is still happening, but it's really about the geographic spread of technological capacities as much as or more than the advance of those technologies. It's about there being more and more places that try to engage in industrial production as much as it's about the new technologies. And so I think in a lot of ways when we talk about automation and technological change, we don't think enough about the global dimension of that spread that focuses on the advance rather than the spread across the world. And it's not just countries like the United Kingdom and Italy and South Korea that have been deindustrializing. Many poorer countries, Brazil and South Africa, have been deindustrializing. They call it premature deindustrialization. It's not only these countries, even China has now been deindustrializing for around 8 years, Mexico for much longer than that. And in fact, according to the United Nations, for the past 8 or 9 years, the entire world has been seeing this deindustrialization trend. And in the book, I try to explain how this is much more due, again, to these globalization trends than it is to any trend in automation that's somehow just starting today. These trends go back 50 years now. And a fundamental argument that I make in my book is that nothing has replaced industrial growth. Nothing has replaced the industrial sector as an engine of growth. And so as we've kind of lost industry as this rapid source of growth, again, I'm not, we would have to talk a lot about industry's role, especially heavy industry in, ecological degradation and destruction. But just from the perspective of the stability of capitalist economies, I'll try to shout over whatever, maybe a moped or something. But nothing has replaced industry as a growth engine for the economy, and especially not in services. So we hear a lot about the transition to a post-industrial world, a world where there's fewer industrial workers, many more workers in services, and this is also true. The world as a whole, the majority of workers in the world today work in the service sector, not in agriculture or industry. And that's true, again, not just in the rich countries, but for the world as a whole, this transition is taking place. What people don't stress, okay, and we can talk about why I don't believe that these new technologies like machine learning and neural networks, I think they will prove incapable of actually raising productivity in services. We can talk about that in more detail if you want to talk about the technological side. I mostly focus on the economic side, but a lot of researchers at Google and MIT are starting to realize that there are very strong limits to what you can do with machine learning. Even with immense processing power, the capacity of machine learning to correctly identify cats and lampposts and stuff, it's hitting its limits. And more researchers are pointing out that actually we've made no progress in the last 50 years towards general artificial intelligence, and machine learning is unlikely to get us there. We can talk about that more if you like. But the result of all of this is that this transition to a post-industrial economy has been associated with, as I've already told you, a productivity slowdown, an economic growth slowdown, and a persistently low demand for labor. And again, what that means is that we live in a world beset by low rates of economic growth, high rates of unemployment and underemployment and precarity, more job and income insecurity, and rising inequality. These are these immense problems we face, and part of what I'm trying to tell you is that these problems are not only about neoliberalism. They're not only about the policies that states and capitalist societies have adopted. They're deeper structural problems that actually started before neoliberalism, and that neoliberalism, in my view, is a response to. The question that I'm kind of going to transition now away from talking about economics, and I'd be happy to talk about that in more detail, I like to think I'm okay at presenting economic concepts in a kind of everyday language, but I know this stuff is difficult. But now I want to switch gears and talk about solutions and how these different ways of conceiving of the problem affect how we think about solutions. One of the big ideas among the automation theorists is that the way to respond to the trends we experience today, unemployment, underemployment, precarity, insecurity, etc., is to implement a universal basic income. And again, in the United States, in the Anglophone world, it's really strange that this view is held by Charles Murray. Do you guys know who that is? He wrote The Bell Curve. He's like one of the most infamous scientific racists in the contemporary world. He is a major defender of the universal basic income idea from the right. He's a follower of Milton Friedman, who is also a big defender of basic income, all the way to people like Philip von Parijs, who's a kind of center-left theorist of basic income, also maybe Guy Standing, someone like that, all the way to a further left, like famously Nick Cernicek and Alex Williams, who wrote the book Inventing the Future. All of these different people advocate basic income. And whenever I talk about basic income, I always start off by saying, there's a lot of reasons to support basic income. It's a really good idea for a lot of reasons, and especially where I come from in the United States, because in the United States we have a very racist welfare state. It was designed to block African Americans from benefiting from using welfare programs. And that meant that in the United States, as in many places in the world, a lot of our welfare systems are means tested. You have to prove that you need these services in order to be able to use them. And many poor people just can't, they don't have the resources to prove their poverty. And it's also very demeaning. It results in all these demeaning programs. And so the idea of having a universal, unconditional welfare support is, I think, inherently a good idea. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, but I think we should really understand why this idea of universal benefits is really important and very laudatory. But what I want to say is that in order for universal basic income to do what the automation theorists suggest, they would have to be right about what's going on in the economy. If the automation theory says we live in a world where our machines, our production, our economy is just becoming so much more productive. It doesn't need human beings. It's producing more and more goods and services without human beings. If that were true, the problem we would face as a society would merely be a problem of distribution. There's all this capacity to produce goods and services, but people aren't earning the wages to be able to purchase it. And that's where UBI comes into the story. It's a way to put income into the hands of people who can't earn wages. My argument is that the problem we face in the economy has to do with production. It's about the slowdown in the economy and the way that in an economy that's geared towards, where people need jobs to survive, this slowdown in the economy is making it harder for people to survive. But I'm arguing that the UBI doesn't deal with the problem at the level of production. And I'll explain why that's important. Oh, there's one more graph, sorry. This graph, again, none of you can see this, so you just trust me about what it says. It's just a graph about the pace of investment in the US economy. And as all these transitions have been taking place, what's happened is that wealthy people in the United States, as well as companies, are just not investing as much as they used to. There's a big threat of what you might call disinvestment in the economy. Capitalists are refusing to invest in expanding. They're not buying machines. They're not purchasing robots. They're not opening up new workplaces as much as they used to in the past. There's this declining trend of investment. And what we've seen in response to that for more than 40 years now, how do governments respond to this trend of firms and wealthy individuals disinvesting or threatening to disinvest or threatening to move elsewhere or keeping their money in finance rather than real investment. We see that governments have spent 50 years trying to improve the investment climate by implementing punishing austerity measures, by removing labor protections, forcing workers to take whatever work they can even when there aren't jobs, and by, against what people often think about the neoliberal state, states have also been accumulated massive debts over the last 50 years. State debt has increased dramatically, and so has debt across society as a whole. And I guess what I think is that because UBI doesn't solve this problem of production, it just happens at the level of distribution, there's no reason to think that UBI would escape these trends in the economy. That is to say that if we did get a UBI, I think it would be introduced at a low level and it would suffer from the same calls for austerity and cutbacks as all the other welfare programs in society. It's precisely because it doesn't break from the logic of a welfare state in a stagnating capitalist society that I think its emancipatory potential is much less than what its advocates imagine. It would really depend on the automation story being true in order to achieve its goals. And we can talk about that. You know, I imagine that could be, for some, a provocative idea. The question to me, the question we really face is living in this perpetually stagnating economy, living in a society where there's constant threats from capitalists to disinvest from production or move elsewhere, you know, and where governments are constantly forced to respond to businesses' claims like, we need better investment climate, you need to remove environmental protections, you need to remove labor protections. The question is, how can we render this threat of disinvestment inoperative? How can we find a way to free ourselves from the constraints of not just a capitalist economy, but especially a capitalist economy facing a future of stagnation? And you know, we can talk about what the coronavirus crisis has done and how it's affected economies. There's a lot of hope right now, especially in the United States, that Biden will implement these big infrastructure bills that'll overcome this stagnation tendency. Because I think it's very structural, I actually think that it's very unlikely that that will generate any lasting change. And again, that's a controversial idea that we can talk about. So the thing that you know, after doing all this research on automation and kind of deciding that, you know, there's something wrong with their vision of what's going on, what the future of work is likely to be, and kind of having this critical perspective, I returned to the automation theory from a different perspective to think about, again, this kind of automation as a utopian idea and its utopian energies, which is why I think it appeals to people so much. And I think it's something that we should really think about. You know, the automation theory says that we can get to a world where, again, everyone's needs are met. There's no question about people being materially insecure anymore. If automation was about to happen, that's a world, not that it would necessarily happen, but it's a world we could get to. They say that, you know, we could live in a world where instead of your whole life being about how am I going to make a living, how am I going to survive, how am I going to earn a wage and get a job, you know, people could have this more expansive and open life where we all, you know, we all have a limited amount of time on the earth, and the question would be, what are we going to do at that time? How are we going to reinvent ourselves or engage in things that we care about passionately? And the question that I kind of asked myself is, are these really, I think, quite beautiful ideas? Is it possible to imagine them being realized even if automation isn't going to happen? Or even if it's not at least right around the corner? And what I became very interested in is the idea that, you know, automation theorists are really dependent on an idea about scarcity and abundance that is really a feature of our world and our economy that I think we can think about in a different way. So if you talk to an economist, they'll say scarcity is the defining problem of humanity. It's the problem that we have infinite wants and needs. but we have only limited resources. And economics is the account of how we make choices about how to use our limited resources. So it's something human beings always experience, will always experience. And what the automation theories kind of suppose is that maybe there's a technology that could give us infinite resources. And then we wouldn't face this problem of choice anymore. We could meet everyone's needs without an economy. And what I became very interested in is this kind of counter-tradition, a different way of thinking about scarcity. That actually is what the root of the term scarcity means. Scarcity didn't originally mean a universal condition of humanity. It meant a period of lack. It referred to a specific period, like a famine, for example, was a period of scarcity. A period where farmers weren't able to produce enough food was a period of scarcity. And there were periods of scarcity and periods where there wasn't any scarcity. And what capitalism did is it really generalized the experience of insecurity that people used to experience sometimes when there were famines. It generalized this experience and made it a constant experience for many people across the world. And there's always been this counter-tradition that says that we could achieve abundance not as some technological change that could come in the future that would make our resources infinite. We could achieve abundance not through technology change, but through social change. Because we could redesign the economy in such a way that we actually organize the economy to meet people's needs. And we see that as the most important thing, to get to a world where everybody's needs are met. And what those needs are is an open question. It's a matter for debate and discussion. But the kind of idea that we should be moving towards a post-scarcity economy, not as an automated economy, not against technology, but not expecting that to come, but rather an economy in which we really center this idea of abundance as a social relationship, abundance as the idea that no one should go hungry anymore, that should never be a question that humanity faces. And this actually, there's a tradition of thinking this way that goes back 500 years, and I've been tracing, this idea at least 500 years in the West, and I've been trying to follow it. And I've been talking a little bit about utopia and utopianism, and I actually think that if you read Thomas More's book Utopia, there was a real program there. Thomas More was living in the era of the enclosures. He was watching all these people get kicked off their land. He was watching them become insecure. And he was watching them be killed for stealing. And he said, this is insane. We should not live this way. We should reinvent the economy. And he describes utopia as a world in which all resources are held in common. Work is shared. The work that has to be done is shared among the population, and there's an effort to reduce the work that people do. That then provides the basis for this free giving of goods and services. Everyone has access to the social storehouses, and that becomes the basis of expanding freedom for everyone. Not just for the nobles, not just for the landowners, but that everyone should have this free time and resources to themselves. That was the kind of utopian program. And he said, in utopia, the defining feature of this world he was imagining was that no one is a pauper or beggar there. And though no one has anything because resources are held in common, all are rich. For what greater wealth can there be than to be completely spared any anxiety and to live with a joyful and tranquil frame of mind with no worries about making a living? And that just spoke to me so much, like living in a world of precarity and insecurity, that going back 500 years, at the very start of capitalism, someone would look at it and say, we should build a world like this, where there's no anxiety, where people have this tranquility and they feel confident that their needs will be met. And there's a long tradition of thinking this. I'm not saying Thomas More was the greatest guy. There were slaves in his vision of utopia. There's a long tradition of taking these ideas from More and clarifying and transforming them. Marx actually, himself was part of this Thomas More tradition, so were all of these other socialist, anarchist, communist thinkers, and we can talk about that. And I think in the 20th century, there was a real attempt to think about what a democratically organized society would look like that met these conditions. And we could even talk about Yugoslavia and its role as a kind of model to people, especially in the 50s and for what that might look like. But what I want to think about today is like, what would a post-scarcity economy look like for the 21st century? And it seems to me that, you know, when we think about what the horizon of change is, I would propose that actually we could agree, maybe, on 4 basic features of the world that we want to build. That kind of are the horizon of change of the struggles and movements of our times. And that would build something like, I'm not committed to the word, I think post-scarcity is an interesting idea and I'll talk to you about it, but I'm not saying we should become post-scarcitarians or something like that. But you know, what would be this kind of common program that envisions a kind of world like post-scarcity but without needing automation to do it? And the first thing, of course, would be expanding, like Thomas More and Marx and these other thinkers suggested, expanding the provision of basic goods and services and maybe income as well. In capitalist societies, you know, welfare states were always limited to supplying some kind of things like healthcare and education, and to some extent housing, but not really the idea of getting to a world where we guarantee that all of a person's basic needs would be met, that they wouldn't be reliant on the wage in order to survive, that we'd really end this world of dispossession and insecurity, to have a much more expanded vision of what those basic goods and services would be that we think everyone should be entitled to just for being a human being. And if we did that, it raises this really important question of like, would people continue to work if they had their needs met? And I think the very asking of that question, you know, what we should think when we hear that is, well, of course, people only work the kind of shitty jobs, excuse my language, the poor quality jobs that they have available today because they have no choice, right? But it doesn't mean actually, if you look at history, that people don't want to do their part or don't want to participate in work. It's that the work we have today in a capitalist society is so bad that most people only go to work because they are afraid of not being able to live. But we could also engage in this process of reducing the maximum working week and sharing the work that has to be done. We live in a society where some people are massively overworked and others are underworked. Some people feel like their jobs are really important, like, for example, nurses working a lot of overtime, doing a really important social service, but burning out on that work, especially in the Corona era. Whereas other people are working these dead-end jobs that feel completely meaningless, they don't have enough work, and their lives are full of insecurity. So engaging in this process of reducing the work week and sharing work, especially sharing meaningful work, and retraining people would be part of this program. And none of that would really be possible, I think, without rendering the capitalist threat of disinvestment inoperative. There's no way, and this is, I think, the most difficult part of a transition to a post-scarcity world, is to remove the capacity of capitalists to limit our possibilities with the threat of disinvestment. We have to socialize the investment process. That is to say that we need to take together in some way, take on as a collective public project, deciding how we're going to use our resources to transform the possibilities of the world that we live in. Where are we going to direct our capacities to revitalize communities, schools, hospitals, or build, I don't know, computers or whatever it is that people want to do. But, you know, this is an idea that's shared, I think, among all these people, from radical Keynesians all the way to the left. And of course, the idea of a Green New Deal or a green transition would be something that would be really important to do if we socialized investment. But I'm quite critical of a lot of the Keynesian revival today, because I think it tends to suggest that we should take on collective public investment to meet people's needs, but in a way that's very technocratic. Whereas I think that the fourth platform that we really need to have is an idea about democratizing all of the institutions of the economy. And here, I should say, I'm very skeptical about direct democracy, which is an idea that, like, we should all get together and collectively make decisions about all the different things that affect us. I'm more interested in the idea of democratizing all of these social institutions that we participate in, democratizing the workplace, democratizing, for example, the process of investment, having people who work in sanitation alongside people who are the end users of sanitation processes, working together to propose what kinds of investments and changes need to be made around these different institutions. I think we need to think a lot, and I've been really inspired here by some of the discussions of green municipalism and a lot of the thought that people in this room have about what it would mean to democratize our different institutions. So I think, to me, I propose that this, that this is the real horizon of change, and it presents a kind of possibility to imagine what our struggles and movements are building toward, how a kind of era of anti-austerity, anti-corruption, anti-neoliberalism, and pro-green transition movements, what we can start to imagine them coalescing around, a vision of social change that's really a vision for the 21st century, and that tries to move beyond the limits of 20th century experiments with, for example, central planning and so on that I think didn't work very well. I'm interested in the question of at least starting a conversation or participating in conversation or provocatively trying to participate in conversation about how we imagine the struggles we're a part of coming together to produce actual lasting and permanent change to get to a world where people really feel this deep sense of security that I think, if you read these texts in this post-scarcity tradition, the idea is that this deep sense of security is really connected to the experience of freedom. The experience that, when we feel our needs are met, we feel also much more free to pursue our passions and to get involved in the projects that we really care about. And just to kind of conclude, I want to say that, for me, these investigations have been really important. I maybe came out of or been a part of various kind of post-work tendencies or something like that on the left. And I think that, it's really important to say we live in a society organized around the Protestant work ethic, and a lot of us are overworked. We shouldn't work so hard. We should rest and relax. But I think that actually that only captures one side of what we want. And there's something really limited about that perspective. Because obviously people who work all the time can imagine a better future as one of rest and relaxation. But I think that when people have had some rest and relaxation, they also want to live meaningful and purposeful lives. And meaningful work, transforming work to be more meaningful would be part of that. And also that the fact that many of the things we do when we're free, the kind of passionate projects we engage in, it's very hard to distinguish between work and play or work and leisure. And that's a really important value that we should have, not just to get beyond work, but also to transform it and imagine a world in which we're free to pursue our passions. I also think that, in a way, and here maybe this is a more complicated discussion, this idea about post-scarcity, it also shows some of the limits of a degrowth perspective. Because I think that degrowth in a lot of ways captures something really important about the limits of, a materialistic society, or just thinking about human needs in purely material terms. Actually, human beings have material needs are really important, but they also have needs for autonomy, needs for meaning in their lives, needs to feel like they're good at something, and these aren't needs that you can meet just by giving people ever more goods. Ensuring people have access to the goods they need to live a full life is a really important part of the story. But what I would say is, for example, I think degrowth focuses a little bit too much on the idea of, in a sense, what I would say is it misses that even in a sustainable world, there will still be dynamism and change. There can still be dynamic change and collective ideas about change, even in a world where there's no growth, because many of the investments that we need to make are actually growth neutral. When we look at our investment capacity, it's the capacity that we have to change the world. And of course, a lot of these industries, investment industries, are the most polluting, like steel and concrete. We've heard a lot about that, the machine industry, and so on. But investment, kind of removed from its capitalist context, is just the resources that we set aside to change our world in the ways that best promote human happiness. What are some of the most important ways we should use our resources today to change our world to promote human happiness? It might not look like building more factories, maybe that's important in some parts of the world. It might look like planting trees everywhere. Planting trees has no effect on the size of our economy, but it makes our lives much better. You know, you might think about investments that improve the work that people do, like make the work more satisfying. These are all different ideas about how we need to take on collectively ideas about dynamism and change that may or may not be connected to growth. So I think that in a way, I don't know if I'm explaining that well enough, but what I'm saying is that there are ways to think about development and change and dynamism and disconnect them from the growth idea. And I think that degrowth, for example, only tells a part of that story. It doesn't have this kind of dynamic quality. And of course, you know, I'm not saying, I think some people say degrowth implies like, you know, that countries in the global south should produce less. Obviously, no one thinks that, right? But I'm pointing to another limit, which is the limit of not being able to think about how even in a sustainable economy, there's still going to be change and dynamism. And that requires a collective democratic process to think about. So I hope anyway that I've given you some provocative ideas, that we can have a discussion about this stuff. But what I'm trying to do here is I'm just trying to, you know, in the talk, I've been trying to think about the positive utopian dimensions of this automation discourse and to point out how reality actually doesn't look like these people say. That's not a good description of where the economy is going. And having a more accurate discussion of where it's going, thinking about these stagnation tendencies, the tendencies towards a post-industrial, slow growth, precarious economy, these structural trends, the ways governments have responded to that with austerity, neoliberal reforms, and taking on debt, how we need to think about how we get out of this situation. And we need to think about how the struggles and movements that are arising today in response to endless austerity and lack of a positive green transformation, how we can think about, for us today, for the 21st century, what our vision is of what that horizon and possibility is. And especially, I think, one that's not dependent on some deus ex machina, some technology coming from the scientists that suddenly frees us, but thinking rather about and accessing these very long-standing traditions for thinking about social change and social reorganization to create a world in which people don't go hungry anymore, they really feel like their needs are met, in which work is transformed, redistributed, and reduced, in which you know, there's collective decision-making about how we change our world, and in which there's an expanded realm of freedom for people to really, even I think in a sustainable world, to pursue whatever their passions are. And I think to kind of live in a way, in a form of kind of an emancipated human society that I really think that we can achieve, and that the movements that exist today are really pointing toward as a possibility. So thank you so much. Listening to me, and I hope we
Thank you, Aaron, for this really inspiring talk. I think that not many people in this room think of economy as, or basic economic concepts as inspiring, but I think that many of us are going to change their thoughts on that after this talk. At least I have, but I don't want to go with my thoughts anymore, and I want you to take the mic and start the questions and discussions. Okay, we have one hand there, the other here. Okay, 3, 4, 5. Now I cannot count anymore. So let's start. Maybe what do you think? Maybe like block of 3 questions and then you answer.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. Jelica.
Sorry, what do you mean when you said people should share jobs? Because there is a lot of jobs which cannot be shared. And there is no any workshop where we can learn how to be good architect or doctor or journalist or something else in, for example, 3 months. Do you mean sharing between people from similar area or what?
Okay, I think Nina was second.
Hi, thanks for really an excellent lecture. So my question would be, I would like to ask you as a historian maybe to reflect a bit on a historical discussion about automation and replacement of human labor that is basically as old as the Industrial Revolution, but it never happened to the extent that it was imagined by theoreticians and scientists. So how it can be useful for the future prospects of the same fear. The second question is related with, I don't know why I'm shaking, is related with, can you provide more concrete fiscal policy instruments if you want to advocate for working time reduction, especially in the peripheral economies? Thanks.
And then in the back, yeah.
At what level could we actually start implementing this? Because when you say socialize the investment, for a lot of countries, or for all the countries, like in Serbia, investment is controlled by, I guess, the IMF and the World Bank, and it's not clear if we can do this like in a single country, or does this take like should we do this at the UN level, or what are the steps towards this solution?
Okay, that's the first block, so Aaron, please.
Great. Okay. So these are all really good questions, and I guess there was a link around the question of job sharing. I think, you know, when I talk about that, I don't mean I think there's a lot of different things it can mean, I guess. But I think that to me, when I look around the world, I really see this problem of overwork on the one hand and underemployment on the other. And I think that, you know, at many different levels of income, you know, across the kind of, I guess as people were saying, sort of core and semi-periphery and so on of the world, this problem exists. And really that there's so many educated people who, you know, have no chance to like find a job that uses their skills, and that there's possibilities for everywhere in the world to reduce work a little bit, and for people then, you know, as you reduce work for some, you can employ other people as well who have those skills and need those jobs. Now, on a longer term level, we would really need a lot of retraining, right? I mean, that's a longer term project of retraining. And I think that to me, something about the world that we live in is that there are very few people have unions or worker associations that represent them and that kind of are participating in this process of educating people and giving them technical training. And that, you know, one of the things that I see is really important is to universalize the experience of, you know, to have more kind of work associations and really think about all labor as skilled labor. Everybody, you know, there's no such thing as unskilled labor. Everybody, there should be associations that kind of develop internal standards and train people to do all kinds of work, and that also defend the dignity of all different kinds of work. There's as much dignity and skill in cleaning as there is, you know, in being a nurse or a doctor or something like that. And it's a really terrible feature of our society that we don't recognize those things. So in the long term, you know, it's not, I'm not utopian in the sense that I think tomorrow everything could be different, right? This is a much longer term idea about how over time we can use our capacity as a society to invest in expanding technical training, in reducing work for the overworked, and finding meaningful forms of employment for the underworked. And that, in my view, especially from an ecological standpoint, there's just no possibility of everyone in the world finding, you know, a 40-hour-a-week job in a full employment planet. It's just there's not enough material resources in the world for something like that. The truth is that we can meet everyone's needs in the world, all sharing the work that has to be done, which is an immense amount of work, but all working less. And having a world where everyone, you know, obviously for those who are differently abled and so on, there'd be a lot of ways of thinking about what that looks like. And I'm not a policymaker, I'm just trying to present in very broad strokes what that would look like. But I think finding ways for people to participate meaningfully in producing goods and services for their community is something that will only be possible with a much reduced work week for all. On the question of the historical dimensions of the automation discussion, in the book I talk about this. Like, it goes all the way back to the 1830s when you have the first kind of ideas, you know, very early in the Industrial Revolution that we're on the verge of automation. This guy Charles Babbage, who invented computing basically in the 1820s and 30s. Andrew Urey, who was a theorist that Marx relied on a lot in Capital. They were theorists of automation. And there's a whole series of cycles in the history of capitalism in the 1830s, and again, I think there's one maybe at the end of the 19th century, and then the 1930s, the 1950s, the 1980s. Again and again, we find this, what I call spontaneous discourse of capitalist societies, periodically reemerging, that says we're on the verge of a breakthrough. And every time, it's either accompanied or shortly followed with a theory that if society doesn't change radically, we're going to experience a catastrophic social breakdown. And I think that, again, to me, we should look to those moments for the kinds of utopian energies they provide and visions of a different world, even if we recognize that they've always been wrong in the past, and as I think they're also wrong today about what our technologies are actually capable of doing. And then a lot of these theorists, they're looking to technology to solve social problems, and we actually have to find social solutions to those social problems. So yes, the automation discourse is a really recurrent discourse about, I think, why there aren't enough jobs to go around. And I should just point out as well that there are much darker theories of why there aren't enough jobs to go around that have, I think, no utopian possibilities. Like, for example, you know, going back just as long, 200 years, there's always been Malthusian accounts of why there aren't enough jobs that say the real problem is poor people having too many children, and that's why there isn't enough work to go around, and that's why we don't get to a world of abundance. You also have, you know, at least 100 years, maybe 150 years of like anti-Semitic discourses that say, you know, Jews are controlling the money supply, and that's ultimately why there aren't enough jobs to go around. So there are really dark and negative visions that recur in society about why there's this persistent problem of insecurity. To me, what's special about the automation discourse, it's not the only way of thinking about that problem, but it's the one that, when it recurs in history, always has this utopian dimension that I think is really important for us to draw on because it points toward a better world. And I highly recommend, you know, reading, like, you know, watching Star Trek or reading this post-scarcity science fiction books or utopian novels. Not, you know, William Morris, who's really anti-automation, News from Nowhere, or Bellamy, Looking Backward. These are really inspiring texts that I think, especially in an age where we can be beset by cynicism, to kind of read that stuff and be inspired is, I think, something worthwhile. And then on the question of, you know, well, how can we do this? How can we socialize investment, especially in a society, you know, or countries on the semi-periphery, which are constantly being beset by, you know, currency crises and forced to go to the IMF and World Bank for loans with conditionality requirements. And I think, you know, to me, I think that there's a long-standing, you know, obviously, history of thinking about the reform-revolution dichotomy, right? And one of the things I've tried to do in my more recent work is to sort of try to sidestep that a little bit and to say, here are the things we need to do. We need to expand universal basic services and goods and maybe income too. We need to you know, reduce and transform work. And in order to do that, we're gonna have to socialize investment, democratize institutions. That one, the one of socializing investment, is the one that I think is the least likely to be possible without a truly dramatic social change. You know, like I think we need to think anew about what we can do while we live in a capitalist society and what really is the non-reformist reform, as it were, in the first talk. I would say the only truly non-reformist reform is to expropriate the holders of wealth and socialize investment. That is the thing which, when we try to do that as much in the United States as in Serbia, we will find that you know, the power that wealthy people have to throw the economy into chaos. For example, think about Allende in Chile in the early 70s. That is the truly difficult horizon of change. And in any society, that is the one which is going to be very hard to achieve without massive, organized social movements in the streets and politics and so on. And that is why it's, in a way, I think, the final horizon. What I found really interesting being here at the conference is hearing people who are involved in politics, trying to make change at the municipal level or at the national level, and confronting this limit, right, of what we can achieve in a world where we depend on capitalists being willing to invest in order to prevent our worlds from being thrown into depression and chaos, and the way that limits our possibilities within this world and requires us to think about transitioning to a different world. So no, I don't think that you know, it's really possible to imagine being achieved in one country, facing the kinds of organized global capacities of the capitalist class, but I think we can have it as a horizon of change, and it's something that we can explore. And I even think that ideas like, you know, modern monetary theory and trying to think about possibilities for, like what we can do or provocative ways of working are at least interesting, even if I think that they are ultimately utopian in a bad sense, that they aren't as possible as they seem. Okay, I hope that was okay as answers to those.
Okay, I would just ask you to say your name and maybe where you come from, something like that, so that we know who is. Okay, so we have one hand here.
Okay,
Sasha
I'll
in the back, Peja, and then Kate, Daniel, and Vujo in the back for the block after this one.
Yeah, hello, and thank you for a wonderful lecture. I'm Alex, I'm from Belgrade. I have a short question. Why do you go back to the unemployment issue in your new book? And could you give us some insights how your approach is going to differ from what you already tried to say in the previous book?
Yeah, great.
Hi, I'm Sasha from ZEMALJSKI platform. I have one very technical question, which is around your thesis or like this evidence that you gave on de-industrialization. How do you explain? I mean, this is completely common sense argument because have no idea about the data. But how do you explain that, there must be increase in goods produced while at the same time, we are experiencing de-industrialization, so how do you explain this? And another one about, I'm very happy you mentioning Star Trek, because this would be like the example of a technological determinism achieved post-scarcity society, and which to me is also a very interesting example of, you know, how to say, disparity between the economy and political system, where political system in Star Trek is completely based on nation state, you know, model, which we are living, and liberal democracy, and this is a huge, how to say, paradox, which is unsolved in Star Trek. And I also think if we were to achieve this post-scarcity idea, which I very agree you know, about, and I love that you were called it socializing investment instead of nationalizing and stuff like that. So how, I mean, yeah, how do we, I guess, approach this, the problem of nation states? Yeah, thanks.
Hello, I'm Peja from Belgrade. I will continue on Sasha. I'm much more interested in some other reason of post-scarcity. For me, it's much more interesting Ursula Le Guin, what is offering and what she writing about post-scarcity. And I will give a little critique from degrowth and from environmental perspective about full automation, because we are still living in limited world and we have limited resources, and we cannot have, for automation we need energy. Even if we find some unlimited source of energy, we need material resources, and we have limited, I don't know, any kind of mining. Only maybe if we're going in this direction, that maybe Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos are smarter and they want to conquer space, and then to like that, to have this fully automated luxury gay communism or solar communism, how they call it. I think it's not possible in this limited world, and for me it's much more interesting this direction where degrowth leading us. And also about working time, even without thinking about unemployment or other things, if we want to live in ecologically sustainable world, we need to work 12 to 14 hours today, even with German productivity, something like that. This is one more argument for reducing working time. And my question is for you also. I didn't understood this last part about how degrowth vision is not dynamical, because for me it's, I believe, like it will bloom hundreds flowers of degrowth, and we will have different local versions of degrowth, and there is no one pathway to degrowth.
Okay. Oh yeah, okay. Because it's my turn. So, okay, on unemployment and what I think about that. So I've been doing a lot of research on unemployment. I mentioned it very limited way in this talk, and talk about it a little bit in this book. But I'm really interested in the history of how we came to think about people not having jobs or people lacking work in terms of unemployment. And I guess something I think has happened over the last 120 years is that there have been these reformers within capitalist societies who are trying to imagine a form of capitalism that works for working people. And they have, over this very long period that goes back to this guy, Charles Booth in England in the 1880s, who experienced the West End riots, and then was like, which was when people, Londoners came from the East End and went and had a protest against unemployment and destroyed a lot of shops. He did this big investigation of worklessness in East London and developed this original theory of unemployment that then was developed in England in the decades that followed. And you can kind of trace this reform project. And I think what I find so fascinating about it is that what theorists of unemployment have always found when they go study the actual lives of working people is that the problem working people face is generally not having a job at all, it's not unemployment, it's chronic underemployment. It's the fact that people have some work but not enough and are changing jobs and experience this kind of permanent employment insecurity. And what I think happened in the 20th century, especially after World War II, with the rise of Keynesianism as a kind of even global economic political management project, was the attempt to the way I think about it is we hear a lot about, in the 20th century, this effort to standardize employment, to make normal standard jobs available to people. But a lot of the way they actually tried to do that was by trying to standardize what it means to not have a job. That is to say, the key in the 20th century to standardizing employment was standardizing the ways that people found themselves without work, to try to create conditions under which, when people didn't have a job, it took the form of having no work at all and being supported by an unemployment insurance program until you found new work, to clearly distinguish the employed from the unemployed. That was a reform project in capitalist societies that also came with this huge effort to build massive statistical capacity to measure unemployment rates and growth rates. That's a connected history. And what happened, in actual fact, all around the world, and first, actually not in the core, but in the developing world, was that these efforts to clearly distinguish the employed from the unemployed failed. They failed very early in countries like Brazil and India, and then in more and more developing countries, there was this big crisis of unemployment, and the International Labor Organization had this huge global meeting, World Employment Crisis, in 1969. And I find that especially interesting because 1969 was the height of full employment in the West. This was like 0% unemployment, basically, in countries like Japan, Germany, France, and the UK, very low unemployment. That from a world perspective, this breakdown of this standard employment relationship was recognized first in the developing world. And then in the 1970s, when you have this big crisis that was also huge in Yugoslavia, a very important part of the story of the breakdown of socialist Yugoslavia in the 1970s, this big crisis in the West that causes mass unemployment. In the West, as in the global South, you see this increasing realization that many people can't be counted in the unemployment statistics because they're experiencing chronic underemployment. And in the global South, it's first called informal labor. So I think that in a way, the tendency of capitalist economies, especially when they stagnate or don't grow very quickly, is to generate this chronic underemployment that actually blurs the boundaries between work and non-work. And capitalist reformers have this dream of that they will be able to separate and distinguish the employed from the unemployed and then find jobs for the unemployed to produce full employment. But that dream has failed, and it's unrealizable today, and it didn't work in the past either. And actually what that means to me is that we should ourselves be skeptical of unemployment statistics and of unemployment as a way of thinking about the problems the world faces, because there's an implicit idea about the solutions. Like, contained in the idea of unemployment is the idea that growth is always a solution. And I'm not against growth in any context, and that's a huge topic to talk about. But I do think that the proper response to endemic insecurity is to directly meet people's needs and to focus on that dimension of the solution to the underemployment crisis, rather than thinking that, if we can just get rich people to buy more yachts and therefore expand the economy, that somehow growth will trickle down to the poorest, because that actually has never worked as a strategy. There has been obviously a lot of poverty reduction for example, in China over the last 40 years, but as Thomas Piketty has shown, only I think 12% of global growth in the last 40 years has actually gone to the bottom half of income earners worldwide. Most growth is captured by the very richest people, and a growth-based solution to employment insecurity is incredibly inefficient as a way to actually improve people's lives. Okay, on de-industrialization trend. Yeah, we are producing more and more goods with fewer people, but it's sort of like what the automation theorists assume is happening is that the reason why we can produce more and more goods with fewer workers is because productivity is getting higher and higher. So, you know, we're producing more and more, and we're producing it in more and more efficient ways, and that's leading to a loss of jobs. What I show when I normally do this talk is that it's just the opposite. It's not that productivity growth is rising towards output growth. Okay, that's like a little technical. We are producing more and more with fewer people, not because we're becoming, like, the speed at which we improve our efficiency is accelerating. It's actually that the pace of economic growth is declining. It's that the amount of additional industrial output we're producing, the pace of that is slowing down. It's actually falling below productivity growth. So it's actually the stagnation trend. The economists call it output-led deindustrialization rather than productivity-led deindustrialization. So actually the stagnation trend is what's responsible for us being able to produce more and more at a slower pace than in the past, even though our productivity is growing at a slower pace. Sorry, that's so technical to try to explain in words. I normally do it on the board, but I gave a shortened version of the presentation. If you want to read a post-scarcity novel that doesn't have nation states, I really recommend Ian Banks wrote this Culture series, and it's very funny because Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg say that some of these novels are their favorite novels. If you want to understand where these technologists, the future that they're pointing to, which is very strange. It's actually, they're inspired by this anarchist, communist, utopian vision of, that's like Star Trek, but without nation states. And Elon Musk actually names his spaceships after the ships from this series. So just if you want to understand the utopian vision of these assholes, you know, in itself, you should read these culture novels. The most famous one is called The Player of Games. But like Star Trek, it's this totally technological account. It's AI. AI removes the need for conflict, basically, right? It's like at the heart of a lot of these technological accounts is this fantasy that we can suppress conflict, essentially. And I think that actually this is a big problem on the left for a very long time. The idea that once we get out of capitalism, we will produce a harmonious community that won't have fundamental conflicts. And I think it's really important to abandon that idea that the future, even beyond capitalism, is a future in which there is conflict. And that's why we need democracy. And we need, you know, we need basically to have civil society and associations that people can join to fight for their freedoms, for their vision of what the needs are that we need to meet. We need a radically democratic idea of a future in which there are civil society associations and in which we don't trust the state or technocrats or technology to suppress and solve conflict for us. And I think that's one of I guess what I just want to say about that, I don't have exact answers on those questions, but I just want to say that, you know, there's a long history throughout the 20th century of people using the phrase democratic socialism to mean something that has nothing to do with democracy, right? And that's something we should think about, that even today when people talk about democratic socialism, you should ask, what do they mean by democracy? Because too often they mean a world, democracy means production for people's needs, not determined by people themselves, you know? And that we should be fighting for a form of, we should develop an account of the world we want to build that could not be realized without democracy. And to me, the fundamental thing about that is to recognize that we will never know really what people's needs are. Those are we can have a general idea of human needs, but actually human needs are always culturally, historically, and even personally specific. And that means that there will be no way to figure out what it means to get to a post-scarcity world without actually listening to people and involving them in a social process of investment that is how we constantly, you know, incrementally change our productive systems so that they meet the needs that people actually have that are specific to their historical, cultural, and personal context. And here I would really recommend, if people are interested in kind of social theory, W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a really important black philosopher, theorist, social activist in the United States, wrote a book called Dark Water that has this really beautiful theory of democracy as fundamental to people being able to articulate their needs in a kind of, pointing towards a post-capitalist society. So that's something that is really important to me. And then lastly, of course, there's different models of degrowth and, and of the Green New Deal, and all of these things are important. And this is a big space of discussion. So I'm not saying that, the same is true in post-work too. These are big open points of discussion. I'm just trying to make an intervention there to say that no matter how we envision a green future, even a world of a sustainable economy, even one that doesn't grow, still changes. And that means that we have to have this democratic process of determining how that change and dynamism takes place, and to disconnect our idea of investment and dynamism from increasing material resource use. And that understanding that no matter how we envision a sustainable economy, we need to theorize how we're going to democratically and socially control that process of dynamism. And I could say a lot more about that. I don't think it should be centrally controlled. I think that basically we would need to have very decentralized investment boards and have protocols for doing that, and that's a whole interesting technical discussion that I won't bore you guys with right now.
Okay, thanks, Aaron. So, third block, okay, maybe Vujo and then Kate and Daniel.
Thank you. My name is Vujo. Thanks for the great talk, really. Two questions. So the first one has to do with how you started off your presentation with this paradox, right? Between automation on one hand, what we would expect to see, and then we see something else, right? And my first question is, how do we know there is any automation at all, right? So just to make myself clear, right? When you showed us the data on the labor productivity, on growth, unemployment and so on, there is like hard economic data. What kind of data do we have about automation, you know? I mean, I don't say it's your obligation to provide us. I mean, I understand you are challenging the discourse, but the proponents, how do they say? I mean, my impression is that there is some automation somewhere, maybe in California, I don't know. But how would we evaluate that? And the second question has to do with the solutions. You said that one of the solutions is democratic institutions, and so they're already affected heavily by automation also. So what you want to present as a solution is already affected by your, let's say, cause of the problem, right? So I know, obviously, like you're dealing with the economy, but there is a political side to it and automated decision making and so on. So it would just be maybe interesting to hear your point about this. How do you see these connections? So that's all. Thanks.
Thank you, Aaron. I think it's really good to have some optimism. I will actually build a bit on Vujo's question, and that's related to the jobs that are already automated. Like I see in Western Europe, I mean, already where I live, many of the services are already automatized, and basically there is quite high unemployment in terms of very low-paid jobs like shops and so on. So my question is also a bit technical, like can you tell us what are the jobs that cannot be automatized? Which I think it's quite important to know, because we know that, I don't know, lawyers and doctors will be needed less and less with automatization. Then my second question is again related to needs. I have a feeling that the entire post-scarcity theory comes a little bit from a very Western perspective, and that somehow the society where, you know, according to Maslow's theory of like ladder of needs, we already fulfilled all of these, so we are talking about the needs that we have, like, you know, after self-actualization or whatever. But then we're also talking from a very global perspective, like how do we deal with societies, again, not really an economic question, but this is something that really bothers me, like how do we deal with societies and countries that live under dictatorships that also haven't achieved this level of you know, needs that are beyond, you know, basic human needs. So I would maybe like your reflection on this. And finally, maybe a bit, yeah, a bit wider question, but do you see any role of digitization of finances? Like, do you see the role, I don't know, of blockchain and Bitcoin, whatever technologies in like redistribution and turning, I don't know, monetary like money into services and tokens and so on? So I would be interested to hear about that.
Prvi red tu, znači, Daniel, we'll take both of you because we're running out of time. So
I had 3.5 footnote questions, so I'm going to try to be very quick. First of all, I wanted to thank you for such a brilliant presentation. While you were talking, I was ordering your book, and I really hope to read it next week.
I still need a publisher in, you know, Serbo-Croatian, so, you know, just something to put out there.
Yeah. And at the beginning of your presentation, you were referring to some titles of people in the left and the right that had been writing before you about automation and technological change. And you were quoting some people who had very utopian or dystopian views about this issue, including some very romantic idea about the kind of future that we could have after this type of technological change. But I was a bit surprised that you didn't refer to other people who have a more balanced opinion, that are critical about the possible misuse of technological change, but are also quite optimistic about the kind of new possibilities for democratizing both economics and politics. I'm referring to people like Paul Mason, post-capitalism, and that kind of title. So that was my first footnote question. The second one has to do about the political economy of automation and technological change. You made only a very tiny reference to governments. There were no real mention to markets. So if you can say a bit more about the role of the state, about the role of the market in all this discussion. This has to do with something that Kate referred yesterday when she included some reference to the book of Mariana Mazzucato, The Entrepreneurial State, or Ha-Joon Chang, Taking Away the Ladder, where they argue that without the state, we wouldn't be talking about these kind of issues. So I'm not idealizing the state, I'm not romanticizing the state. I have a lot of criticism to Mazzucato and Ha-Joon Chang, but I think we need to bring a political economy perspective into this discussion. My third footnote question has to do with the meaning of industrialization, because I think it's a bit problematic that you included in some of your charts at the same time countries of the global north and countries of the global south. You refer to South Africa, Chile, I think, no, it wasn't Chile, Mexico, Brazil. And industrialization and manufacturing doesn't have the same meaning in the global north and in the global south. The kind of goods that are produced, the way industrial production is organized has been totally different for the past, well, not totally, but it has been different in the past 5 decades. And also the type of indicator that you use, because you use level of employment to look at declining industrialization. But if you look at share of the GDP, for instance, in some of these countries, maybe the result of the chart is going to be different. And the half question that maybe we can leave it for the coffee break. I would really love to hear your take about recent discussion among Marxists about value creation, theory of value, and some challenges to that. So I'm sure you have a lot to say to that discussion, but maybe that's for lunch.
Yeah, go ahead, because...
Sorry to add to this very big pile of questions.
I love it.
I was wondering about energy, less as what you see as the role of energy, less as a scarce resource in itself, but as kind of a structuring principle. There, as you're probably aware, is sort of a parallel of the kind of automation theorist looking at the potential of solar power and renewables by virtue of being decentralized to create, a more radically democratic society at the most sort of utopian end of that. And there's there are sort of other folks who see it as largely incidental, right? That, societies develop and energy is just an input to that process. So I'm wondering from, the scale of that to a sort of like vulgar carbon democracy view, sort of where energy fits into this, and yeah, just how you think about that.
Yeah, great. Okay, I will try my best, and I'll group my answers to some of these for time. So I should say that, I think one thing I usually remember to say, but I don't think I said this time, I definitely didn't, is that I think it's very important to recognize that automation is always happening in a capitalist society. Productivity is always growing, not every year, but incrementally over time, and therefore also exponentially. And what that means is that automation is just a constant feature of the world, and there's always jobs that are being destroyed. It's actually, when you look at history, and I'm curious when you say that there's a lot of services already being automated, I'd be curious which ones you're thinking of, because one thing I've noticed is if you actually try to look at specific jobs that have been automated out of existence in history, there aren't as many as you would think. Like, a lot of technologies are more about reorganizing work and changing job categories than about fully automating them. Often you'll hear people refer to elevator operators and telephone switchboard operators and movie film projectors. What are other common ones? Travel agents might be a more recent one, though there are still some, but it's kind of disappearing. And I guess that so it's more common for technologies to reorganize work, and it's hard to find examples. And I find it very funny to me when, you read these interviews with automation theorists, and the first question journalists always ask is, what jobs have recently been automated out of existence? And they always give, if you really think about how they answer it or look at what they say, they always give an answer that's about the future. They have very few evidence, things to actually point to in the present. And so what I mean to say here is that automation in the sense of technological change is always happening, and it's happening today. The thing is that the claim that these people are making is that it's happening, there's been a breakthrough that's causing it to happen more quickly than in the past. Whereas the reality is that, on the whole, it's happening less quickly. But it does mean that automation theorists, there's tons of things you can look at. There's all of these examples that you can pull out from society of technologies like advanced robotics in factories. There's always examples you can draw from. The question is, when you look at it as a whole, and to be able to see that on the whole, although there are examples of automation, on the whole, the economy is actually seeing a slower rate of technological changes measured by labor productivity than what they believe. So the answer to the question, why do they think it's happening? It's because it is happening. Automation is always happening. It's just happening less quickly than in the past. And it's only by taking on this more historical vantage point that you can kind of see this very surprising trend. And again, in the book, and when I usually do these presentations, I exactly try to show how if you just look at the very recent period, it looks amazing. Like we really are producing more and more manufactured goods with fewer workers. But then looking historically at why that's happened, you can see that it's really the stagnation trend, not the productivity trend, that's causing it. There were a bunch of questions about, and I should say, like, yeah, I think to some extent we are going to see digitalization of services, finance, lawyering, etc. But I'm very skeptical that those things will have the effects that automation theorists suggest, and there are many more balanced perspectives, especially in the last few years, where MIT has done a study, the OECD has done a study, and all these more recent studies point out big gaps in the original automation research of the 2010s, and show that much more likely is what they call like partial automation, or interactions between human and machines are much more likely to continue to happen than full automation of a lot of jobs. On the question of democratic institutions and the political side, I should say that I really, I have an article, if you're interested, that's called, has a deceptively simple title. It's called How to Make a Pencil, which is a reference to this very famous, like, short story that Milton Friedman, it's like a children's story about how great capitalism is. It's called I, Pencil, and it's supposed to be a short story. Friedman didn't write it, but he was a big promoter of it, about why capitalism is so great and why no society can replace it. And so my text called How to Make a Pencil is an account of the limits of capitalism for dealing with complexity and how to build a post-capitalist society that can deal with a complex economy. And one of the things that I think is really important is that we have these people pointing toward fully automated luxury space communism and a vision of technology as replacing human decision-making. But actually the thing that's so, if we put a socialist from the 1910s in the world today, they would be surprised by many things, and above all by the fact that we don't live in a socialist world. They would be really surprised by that. But the other thing they might say is that, wow, these communication and information technologies we have actually would make our social decision-making much more possible than any time in the past. That is to say, I'm interested in how digital technologies can be used to improve democracy and communication and so on, rather than replacing human decision-making. They can actually clarify it and make it more possible. How to actually do that is complicated. I think if we look at efforts of digital parties like Podemos and Syriza to bring digital tools into their party platform design and internal election systems, we see that direct democracy with technologies is actually really difficult to do and has very counterintuitive consequences. But I think this idea of using technologies to democratize workplaces and coordination between them actually has a lot of possibilities. I can't describe that here, but if you are interested in what I think about it, you can read How to Make a Pencil, which is with Logic magazine. On the question of maybe related to that, of how we determine needs, I think, people are very rightly critical of Maslow and critical of this idea of a hierarchy of needs. And a lot of the research since Maslow has shown that there really isn't a hierarchy. Like, even people who have trouble meeting their very basic needs for food and shelter benefit from personal autonomy and possible experiences of self-realization. This actually isn't a hierarchy. And even in a country as rich as the United States, I assume many of you know, there are so many people whose very basic needs for healthcare, housing, and food security are definitely not being met. So these aren't issues of hierarchies. And in fact, the whole point is that we shouldn't engage in this technocratic project of trying to scientifically determine as experts what human needs are. That, I think, is what we should really be skeptical of. Any kind of what I would call philosophical anthropology, any attempt by scientists and experts to define what human beings are and what they need in some fundamental way. Instead, that's the work of democracy, is to find and explore human suffering and human possibilities and needs in a way that pays attention to historical, cultural, and personal experiences. Okay, I know we're getting tired here, so I will just say to a few of the other questions on the role of the state and the market. I find Mazzucato, if you guys have heard of her, she's this very important contemporary economist who actually used to be a Marxist and went through this whole Keynesian conversion. But what's really important about her work is to attack this neoclassical idea that markets are good at innovation. And someone gave a presentation here where they pointed out that the vaccines for COVID were publicly funded, right? Those aren't actually examples of capitalist market innovation. In reality, all of the things about the digital economy, GPS, touchscreens, the internet itself, these are all state and publicly funded projects. And that's really important to see that actually, especially in the 20th century, research and development has been a collective, public, and actually planned process, not a market discovery process, as neoliberal thinkers like Hayek suggest. What I find so scary about Mazzucato is that she's basically saying that the main innovative institutions in our society are the military-industrial complex. Like, she's talking about innovation. She's like, look at these amazing innovations that come out of the US military, one of the most terrifying and horrible institutions, in human history. And so that's why in my work I would really emphasize the need to have democratic public institutions. I think it's very frightening that people like Mazzucato don't have a critique of state power and seem to not recognize that, when we build up military technology, when we think building up the state capacity to invest means investing in those kind of institutions, inevitably those institutions will be used for imperial and neo-colonial projects around the world. And I'm always frightened by the way that Keynesian thinkers have nothing to say about democracy or do a little hand-waving about it in their work. And so, let's see, can I end on something positive? Because that's what I would prefer to do. And there's still a bunch of questions that I didn't answer. For example, I think it's very interesting to think about, ideas about fusion and these kinds of visions of post-scarcity based on unlimited energy and renewable resources that might have a parallel to some of the other accounts that I've been talking about. I think it's really obvious. I think one of the things about people like Mazzucato and recent economic stuff that I find really interesting is that we're so far beyond the 90s moment where people thought climate change could be solved with a market in carbon credits. It's so obvious to people that we need, big public investment to do it, or we need big investments to do it. And I think that, I think there is a huge amount of, it's a really important thing for socialists or anyone interested in an emancipatory future to think about these questions and to really see that it seems very difficult to imagine that we'll ever achieve a sustainable future without some kind of socialized control over energy production. It's just once we see those limits. One of the things I'm trying to do in my work, sorry if I'm rambling a little bit because it's the end and I did stay up dancing till 3 a.m. But one of the things that I think is really important is to see that we can live in a world where people experience abundance in the sense that they feel very secure that their needs are going to be met, even in a world where we have to constrain our energy use and production, even on a planet that's more ravaged by extreme weather events. All those things are going to make life worse, but actually they don't prevent us from imagining a world in which we prioritize meeting people's needs and producing a kind of real material felt security for people that makes them free. That is really a possibility even on a planet that faces extreme weather events and climate destruction. We need to avoid that future. We need to try our best to avoid warming, But even on a planet like that, like even on a planet that is less ecologically wonderful than the world we've inherited, it's still possible to imagine a kind of future of mass human security. And in fact, it seems obvious to me that unless really meeting people's material needs is part of the climate transition, it's just not going to be possible. Like the post-scarcity program, in whatever that would look like, really is the only possible way to imagine a kind of a transition to a green future. We have to center a democratic process of meeting people's needs as part of energy transition, or it's going to look really horrible. So maybe that's a kind of sort of post-scarcity or sort of civilizational collapse kind of thing. But anyway, I just want to say again that I'm just really excited to be here. I feel like going to the presentations, I've heard so much and I've learned a lot and been really inspired by the things people have been saying, from the kind of ideas about green municipalism and a kind of idea about what a democratic economy would look like in a kind of theoretical way or as a vision of the future, to the real attention I've seen here to like concrete political experiments and concrete projects to kind of build a better future. So I just want to emphasize again how thankful I am that I was invited to speak here and to participate, because I think that that what you guys are doing here is really amazing, and I hope that you guys are also going out into the world to bring your insights to people in other regions, because I think there's a lot to be learned from what's going on here. And also, I felt a lot of actually kind of optimism in a way about what potentials there are here for change in the moment that I found really inspiring. So thank you again so much for having me and for all your questions.